All right, now I'd like to get into functions. Functions are a really exciting part of JavaScript. They're really something that that you can use. It's a tool that you can use to really supercharge your code. I think it's one of the core key things to understand about programming in general. Almost every language out there has some concept of functions. The general idea is that we need a way that we can package some code, save it for later, and keep reusing it again and again. And so that's what functions are, but we're going to get a lot deeper into them in this talk. And so let's get right into it. And so I'm going to be talking today about the following topics: what is a function? Why use functions? How to create functions? Calling functions? Parameters? Arguments? Returning values from functions, even how to test them, and then what's going to be, basically what we're going to do with them going ahead, and the exercises and stuff that are coming up going ahead. So just some background info first, which is that what is a function? Well, a function is a reusable block of code. It's a very simple thing. Functions work a lot like equations do. You can give them inputs, they can produce outputs, and one of the key things of a function is that it should be something that's predictable, something that's easy for other people to understand, and possibly reuse as well. So functions are an important part of control flow because we can run that same block of code wherever we want. And so, for example, they are a easy way for us to run the same. I guess this is something that you'll see as we practice with them, but just know that they are a very important part of control flow. They're also very helpful in larger programs. It's helpful for us to make functions that are smaller and simpler and really just do like one thing, so that your program can be organized in a way that is easy to understand. And as the program really grows, your code will not get out of hand. And so. Finally, breaking code into functions also makes it a lot easier to test, and I think that's one of the advantages that you'll see over time. And so now I want to get into just seeing what does it feel like to make a function, and we're just gonna write some code together and run it and see how it works. And so let me get right into this coding editor here that I have open. I have a file open here already, functions.js, and then let's see what does it look like to have a function. So I'm going to make a simple function. We'll call it I'm a function, and notice that the first thing I did here. So I'm just going to make this empty function. The first thing I did here is write the keyword function. And if you are using a good code editor like Visual Studio Code or even Sublime Text or TextMate or a bunch of other ones, most likely you'll have some form of syntax highlighting, which actually will make it very easy to tell a keyword from variables, from text, other things. And so here you can tell, because the word function is blue, that this is a keyword in JavaScript, and so you need this when you're defining a function. Next comes the name of the function. In our case, it's I am a function. Then there are two kind of open and closed parentheses here. These seem like very small, but they're actually very important, because eventually they will actually specify what kind of inputs this function can take in. And so I think it'll be pretty important eventually. And then we have these open and closed braces. And the main purpose of these open and closed braces are just to indicate to the program that, now I'm going to tell you the code that is a part of this function. And, basically the code that's a part of this function will be in between those open and closed braces. And so let's say, we make a very simple function. All we're going to do is have it output some text. So we'll say console .log I am or like hello world, right? So something very simple. And now let's try running this code. So So I'm going to open up a console here right inside our code. This is something nice that you can do inside Visual Studio Code. So I'll save this function here, and you can see I have that file already here. So I'll just say node functions.js, and we run it, and nothing happened. That's interesting, right? So nothing happened, and this is actually the exact, this is actually something specific that I want to get into here, while I'm talking to you. Like, why did nothing happen? Well, that's because defining a function itself doesn't do anything. All it does is that it tells the computer, okay, this is what I want to happen when this function runs. And it's kind of like writing down a recipe for a dish, like like your favorite dish. You kind of write down the recipe so that later when you or somebody else wants to make this food, you'll know what the instructions are. That's exactly what writing a function is. It's just writing down the instructions. Now, if you want to execute the instructions, then there is, so that's called invoking a function. The way that you do that is by simply writing the name of the functions. I am a function. So one thing you'll notice here is that Visual Studio Code actually pre-fills. It's actually pretty nice in that it allows us to really speed up our coding by reading what functions are available already. And so we write so in order to invoke a function, we write the name of the function, and then we put the open close parentheses and then semicolon. But now notice that the difference between what we've written up here, I am a function, and what we're doing here by invoking a function is that we don't have the function keyword. The function keyword is what really separates the definition of a function and the invoking of the function. And so now that I have defined the function and I have invoked it, let's see what happens when I run this file. Oops, I didn't save it. So let's try running it. Boom, there you see. So now when I run this file, I get a hello world right here. So I hope that kind of made sense. And so, all right. So we can actually also do a little bit of an experiment here, just to see just to kind of see the power of the calling of the function. So I've invoked this function once, but I can actually just invoke it as many times as I want. So this is something that's not immediately obvious, but I could just write again, I am a function, and now that I've written it twice, what will happen is that we'll be essentially this will run the same function twice. So let's just clear what we have so far, and we will run this file again. I'm just going to run this file once, and again, I didn't save it. So I'm just going to run this file once, now that I've saved it, and you see that hello world gets printed twice, which means that we call this function twice. And that's really, you're starting to see the power of having functions, because we've only defined it once, and we can run it as many times as we want, wherever we want, and it will kind of do whatever instructions are in here, basically for us. And so, by the way, you can also have multiple lines in the function. Of course, it doesn't have to be just one line. You can have as many things as you want. So, okay. So the next thing that I want to discuss about functions are something that we would call parameters and arguments. And so let me just make a little break here, and then let's talk about parameters and arguments. All right. So what are parameters and arguments? Well, what if we wanted to make a function that did not just say hello to world, but said hello to anyone that we wanted to? And so I'm just going to copy this this function here. I am a function, and let's rename this guy to just be the hello function. Now, right now, we've hard-coded world as the only thing that we can say hello to. So now, instead, if we wanted to say hello to somebody else, we would right now not have an option. But so this is where we'd want to use parameters and arguments. So let's say the way to make the way to define a argument in the function definition is to put a variable name in between these two parentheses in the function definition. So like right here, let's say, oops, I was gonna write name, but I just thought of my name. So I put the variable name here, and now if you remember from how we messed around with strings, what I can do is I can say plus name in the console log. So now look at how this function has changed. We have the argument name here, and then we are using that. So this argument becomes a variable that all the code inside of the function can access. Okay, let me say that again. So the argument that you define here, and by the way, this can be as many arguments as you want. So I've just defined one, but if you wanted to define another one, you could also do that, something like that. But let's just stick with one for now. So this argument becomes a variable that all this code down here can use, right? So in the same way I'm using it here. Now let's see what happens when we run. So now let's comment out this stuff here. Oh, actually we actually changed the name of the function, so it's not going to do anything anyway. But let me just comment out so we don't see a lot of extra output. So let me just invoke this function the way that we were invoking the previous function. So I'll just say hello on its own. So that's how we were invoking this function here, right? So now remember that we've added this this argument parameter thing, but we've not really changed the way that we're invoking it. And so now if we run this file, of course, again, I forgot to save it. Let's clear it. And so now let's try running this file, and you'll see that this says hello undefined. And this is actually a pretty important, this is actually something important to notice because we have not passed in anything for name, and so the default value, so basically name is undefined, and so we see hello undefined. Now instead, if we had passed in hello, let's say Nimit here, and save it, and then we'll see that our function says hello Nimit, right? So this is not all that crazy, I know, but yeah. So okay, so let me do another interesting thing with this, which is so now this is where the power of functions really comes out, which is that you can use the same lines of code, but just change a few things about it, which are the parameters that you pass in. So let's say I want to say hello to another person, David. So I say hello, David. Now I've not written this function twice, right? All I'm doing is calling this function with different parameter values here. And so I save this and we run this file again. We see hello Nimit, hello David. Now that's pretty exciting, right? Like the thing to appreciate here is that you didn't have to write console log hello multiple times. All you were able to do is basically say hello Nimit, hello David twice, and it worked. This actually also works if you were to make a new variable. So let's say we do let person equals let's say world. Let's go back to our world example. I could also call hello person. Well, this is kind of messed up, right? Because world is not a person, but let's just say hello thing. And so here I'll change this to thing. And so see, all I've done is I've defined a variable here. I'm passing the variable in, and we'll actually take a look at what's happening. But let's just see what happens when we run this first, so we have an idea. Notice that we see hello Nimit, hello David, and then hello world. Now let's just double check that we understand what is happening here. So we're setting the value of thing to be the string world, right? And then we're passing thing into hello, but really what's being passed is basically what is behind this variable. So what's behind this variable? It's the string world. And so that string gets passed right here into the function's parameter. It kind of comes into this function as it kind of, ports into this variable called name, and then here we can use it as name. And this understanding is actually very essential, is that just you really have to observe how I'm going to actually even delete these two because they're too simple. And really, if you understand this key, like these 6 lines here, if you really understand these 6 lines, I think, we'll have made an incredible amount of progress. And so essentially there's a world, which is created here, the value is assigned to thing gets sent to, while we're invoking hello, and the value of thing gets passed into the function. It gets renamed to whatever was the parameter here. It doesn't have to be name. It could also be, we could actually even just call it thing. If I really wanted to make it more confusing, we could actually just call it thing, and this would still work. Which, let me demonstrate to you. So notice how this still said hello world, because whatever you put here, let's say instead I will just put variable x here, then I could use variable x here as well, and this will still work. Okay. Now, what if I just used thing here directly, right, instead of variable x, because I'm defining it down here, right? What will happen? Let's try it out. So let's save this, and notice that we actually got the right text again. Isn't that crazy? Well, the reason that happens is that we define the variable thing to be world. Even though we are passing in this value of world into this function, and here it's being called x, when this function is actually executed, which is down here, this is where hello is executed. Down here, the variable thing already exists, right? It's defined on line 16 here. And so this line actually is not referring to this x variable. It's referring to this this kind of variable. It's pretty much like a global variable that's defined on line 16. And so that's why it still ends up working. But really, if what we want to, this is actually something that ends up working, but it's not really using the function parameters. And so we really want to be using the function parameters x. Whatever the name of the parameter is here, that's what we want to use. And the reason for that is that this function could actually live anywhere, right? Like, we could have this function be in a different file also. There's no guarantee that this global here will be available. And so you really want to use the parameters inside of the function in order to do whatever the function is going to do. Once in a while, you'll need to use global variables also inside of the function. It's not all the time, but it does happen. But here we wanted to talk about how to use parameters. So let's now also demonstrate how we could say use multiple parameters, right? So now let's say we wanted to say hello to a full name, not just one variable. So let's say I wanted to do. So let me just give us some space here. Oops. Okay, so let's say I wanted to do first name and last name. All right, so there are two variables, and so I will say first name plus, let's have a little space in between first name and last name, and then last name. And so now we'll be saying hello to first name and last name. So now, if I just passed in one of these, so we have two parameters here. If I just passed in one, what would you predict will happen? Or do you remember what happened a little bit ago when we executed the function without providing any variable? Well, let's see what would happen. So let's save this here. And so if we run this, we should get undefined, right? Because so what's happening is that we are passing in one variable here, but we're not passing in the second variable. And so the second variable is undefined. Now, the variables that you pass in have to be in the same order that the variables that you define here. So the first thing that you pass in will be considered first name, and then the second thing you pass in will be considered last name. So now let's try to pass in the full thing and see it work. Let's say first name equals, let's say Gabby. Let last name equals Medina. All right, and so now if we want to pass in first and last, we want to pass in both Gabby's first name and last name. So we'll say first and last. And now remember, the values that these variables represent will be sent into this function as the parameter. So even though the variable names here are not the same, so this is just first, and here it's first underscore name, right? So the variable names are not the same. The values that the variables represent is what will be sent into the function as a parameter. And so let's save this, and then if we try running it, you see that this worked well. And so hopefully that made sense. All right, so let's switch to the next interesting topic about functions. So the next major thing that I want to discuss about functions are the idea of the functions returning something. Okay, now we've seen how to use a function to basically run a couple of lines of code and then possibly console log a couple of things to console log some text to the output, right? And so that's what console log does. But now, what if the function that we were defining was actually, let's say, a calculator, okay? So let me actually comment out this old code. What if the function that we were defining was something like a calculator, where we wanted to be able to use the result of the function in another calculation, right? So we didn't just want to print it out, we want to use it in another calculation. And so let's see how that would work. So let's say we make a function called plus, right? So we'll say function. Now, of course, this is not, because there's already a plus operator in JavaScript. There's not, this is not the most useful function, but it will still, demonstrate our point. So let's say we have two variables, a comma b, so a and b, two parameters, and all we want to do is return the addition of a and b. Okay, so what would I write? Well, I would say let sum equals a plus b, and so now the variable sum equals the addition of a and b, and now I'm going to introduce a new keyword here called return sum. And so what return does is that it will take whatever value you're returning and kind of send it back to the place where the function was invoked. Okay, so let's just demonstrate how this works to see it. So now that this function is defined, remember function definitions don't do anything, they just define a bunch of things. So now this function is defined, and if I wanted to plus two numbers, I could call this function as plus 10 and 5, and so this should return 15, right? And so let's say if I wanted to console log whatever was returned here, I could do console.log, and notice how I'm actually able to pass in the function in like the invoked function itself into console.log, right? This is really cool. And so this is the power of return, is that whatever invoking this function returns, essentially using the return keyword, will be substituted where this function is invoked, right? So if 15 is returned, then 15 is what will be logged to the console, right? So let's just double check that this works and telling the truth. So there you go. You see 15 got returned. If all we did was call the function without console.log, right? notice that nothing happens. And nothing happens because return is different from console.log. Console.log is a specific thing. It's kind of like console.log is kind of like printing a document on a piece of paper. Whereas of course here the piece of paper is the console. Console.log itself is a separate action that just displays a value on the console, right? The console is essentially a log. It's a logbook. All you're doing is spitting some text out on the console. But returning it is much more powerful actually, because returning it means that you can use that value and continue in your program, right? So now, even though we have not console.log plus 10 comma 5, this actually represents the value 15. And so now if I wanted to do some further things, like for example, let's say I make another, let's say I wanted to add an additional 3 into whatever comes out of this plus call, right? So I could do something like var, sum, or let x equals 3 plus 10 comma 5. So we know that this plus 10 comma 5 represents 15, and we're going to add 3 to that, and so x's value should be what? 18, right? So let's console.log x. Now notice we have to use console.log when we want to kind of see what value a variable represents, but we don't have to console.log everything, right? Because even though this computation happens in the code, we didn't have to console.log what plus itself returns, only whatever we want. So let me save this and then run this file again, and boom, there I see 18, right? Because we are getting 15 from this plus function call, and then we're adding 3 to it. Now here's something cool. Let's say we want to create a new function called multiply, and let's see if we can use the value that comes out of calling plus and directly send it into a new function called multiply. So let's make a new function, multiply. We'll do the same thing here with a comma b, and this time, instead of setting a new variable sum or product or whatever equal to something, we're going to directly just return the product of a times b, and so let's say return a times b. See, that was a bit shorter. In fact, here also we could have done something similar. And so now we have this function called multiply available to us, right? And so now instead of consoling x, instead of console logging x, let's actually use x and actually, you know what? Instead of even using x itself, I actually want to directly just use a plus function call. So I'm just going to make a brand new multiply call here. So let's say I'm going to make a new variable here called let y equals multiply. Now, notice what I'm going to do. I'm going to, let me get us a little more space here. So I'm going to pass in actually a function call, right? So remember, when we called plus 10 comma 5, that resulted in 15, right? That returned 15. So here I'm going to do plus 10 comma 5, just for, we'll just keep it consistent just so it's easy to understand. And so this will now represent 15, and then I'm going to pass in 2 here. And so let's just take a moment to understand this line here. So we're calling the multiply function. We are passing in the result of calling the plus function with 10 comma 5 passed to it. Now this 10 comma 5 is not passed to the multiply function. It's only passed to the plus function. Once the plus function runs, it will return the value of 15, and essentially this, so essentially what will happen is that multiply will get 15 here, like this, right? But see, you don't actually have to do that. You can just let it, you can just write plus 10 comma 5. And then 15 will be passed into multiply as A, and 2 will be passed in as B. And then, of course, the return value will be 15 times 2, which is 30. And we can now try console logging y here. And let me actually comment this out so we don't get confused. And so we'll console log y, and now we should see 30. So let's try that. We'll go back into the console and run it. And there you go, we see 30. And so I hope that clarified a little bit about how the difference between return and console log, which is that return actually sends the value back to the place where you call the function, and that you can, that value is now in play. It can be used by wherever you are calling it, and then the next line is, basically, essentially, what console.log does is that it simply takes a value and prints it to the console, which is a very specific use case. It's actually the return keyword is much more powerful because you can use the return value and do a lot more with it. And so, okay, so let's do a little bit more. Let's do a little bit more practice with returning a value. Now, maybe we can actually, since we learned about conditionals, if else statements in the previous in our previous lecture, we can actually use some if else statements to make this return, to learn how to use the return function. And so let's say we make a new function called is even. Okay, so we'll make a new function. So let me just comment this out here, and let's say okay. So more practice with return. So let's take a function that checks if a number is even. Okay, so we'll say if actually let's say function is even, and then this will take a number x, and they should return true if the function were even, false if the function is not. And so, well, how do we check if something is even? Well, one of the characteristics of a even number is that all even numbers are divisible by 2, right? And so we can actually use the modulus operator here. And let me just tell you a little bit more about modulus operator. Oftentimes is actually just called mod. So let's say we can say if x mod, so the mod operator is essentially just the percent sign, x mod 2 equals 0, then return true, else return false. Now, let's go back to what does mod do exactly? Well, modulus essentially returns the remainder of, so x modulus 2 returns the remainder of x divided by 2, right? So if x divided by 2 has a remainder of 0, which means that 2 evenly goes into x, then this is an even number. Like, for example, just to do an example, let's say 4 divided by 2 equals 2, right? And so here, even though the division answer would be 2, the modulus would be 0 because there's no remainder. On the other hand, if we did 5 divided by 2, well, if you remember kind of the elementary school way of division before you learn about decimals, 5 divided by 2 would actually be 2 with a remainder of 1, right? Because 2 goes into 5 2 times, and then there's 1 remainder. And so this remainder of 1 is what modulus is. The reason that this operator even exists is that it's actually very useful in doing exactly what I'm doing here, which is it's useful for, there are a lot of times where knowing the remainder can actually be helpful. So is even is like so, and then we return true and return false. All right, and so now, notice how we are using return here, not console log, right? Because we want to be able to use the return value to do something. Now, let's say if we wanted to print x, as like a certain number is even if it's even, or print is odd if it's odd. So let's use the if statement. So let's say we have a number, let num equals whatever. So I'm just going to hardcode it to 10 for now. And so let's try using our is even function now. So if we were to write an if statement here, we would write if is even num. Now notice I'm passing num into the is even function, so the value of 10 would go here, and then x would represent the value of 10 here, right? So we say is even num. If is even, now let's console log, just for our demo purposes, console log num plus is even. All right, so as simple as that. And then remember, we also have the else keyword. So if the is even returned false, then we would of course go into the else. Then we'll have a very similar line to this over here, and we will say is odd. All right, and so since we know that 10 is even, what we should see is what? We should see 10 is even when we run this. Let me save it, start running it, and there we go. So we see 10 is even. Now if I were to change this to 9, and since 9 is odd, we see 9 is odd. Okay, so I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about how the return keyword works, how we can use the return keyword to actually make functions very powerful, because now we can, like let's say if this function is defined somewhere else, and let's say there are a lot of places in our code where we need to test if something is even, well then all we have to use is this is even word here. We don't have to rewrite this whole if statement here, right? Now these are very simple examples, but when these functions get really large and kind of complicated, it's actually very helpful to have a certain complicated functionality stored away in a function, and then just be able to use that function whenever you want, and that functionality would be available to you. And so I hope that has made sense. So now let me go back to our a couple of slides here, just so we can talk a little bit more about what is just how what the next steps are here. So functions are pretty easy to test, and really they're easy to test because there is a input and an output usually, right? And so starting with the practice problems for this workshop, we will be writing at least one function in every problem. And if you notice the test, the tests will call the functions that you write, and it will test the outputs. So the tests will pass in different arguments to your functions, and then whatever is returned is what will be tested. And so that's how we'll know whether your function is written correctly or not, because we'll be able to know whether the return output is what we're expecting or not. Okay. So make sure you read the prompts carefully. They will clearly state what value your function should return. So make sure you read the tests and the prompts carefully. We've tried to be as clear as possible. And if by chance your tests are not passing, then please double check that you are actually returning a value and not console logging it. And so make sure you're using the return keyword and you're returning a value and you're returning the right value. Okay. And so let's do a quick recap. So we talked about essentially a number of topics today. We talked about what a function is, why use functions, how to create and call a functions. We talked about parameters and arguments, and also about returning values from a function. Finally, you're going to be seeing a lot of functions and using kind of test-driven development as you do the upcoming exercises. Okay, and so essentially, this is our last pre-work lecture together. After we do this lecture, we'll be jumping into the core material of the Bootcamp Prep course, and that should be fun. I think Next, you should essentially look at the practice problems that are there, and yeah, and good luck. We will we will see you throughout the course. All right. So yeah, thank you.